Leximus began to counterattack with all her strength. Cyan started blocking without much effort and praised her for having good moves. Our boy was blocking the attacks as if nothing, and he couldn't help but get excited. With a smile, he asked her to try a little harder. He began to stare at her and with an arrogant smile asked if this was all she could do, asking her to attack with the intent to kill. Leximus was using all her strength to attack. She began to sweat and her eyes filled with confusion. She was the one attacking but was not able to reach him with her sword. She gripped the sword tightly and her eyes began to shine. She launched herself into the attack and became determined to try to reach him with the sword. Just before she could attack, Cyan moved quickly and with a smile struck her on the head with the pommel of his sword. Thinking it was enough, she closed her eyes, clenched her teeth tightly, and couldn't help but feel furious. Her sword fell to the ground far away, and just then, she also fell on her butt to the ground. Cyan began pointing the sword at her and with a smile explained that letting emotions get out of control created countless gaps in her attacks, advising her to be careful with that in the future. She looked away, and her eyes filled with sadness upon seeing that she couldn't be his opponent. She thought it was nice to be so strong. Cyan rested the sword on his shoulder, placed his hand on his waist, and with a calm look mentioned that she was skilled and asked her not to feel down. She was capable of freely wielding a sword that even most adults would find difficult. Upon hearing this, Leximus's gaze filled with surprise, making her unable to avoid blushing. If she kept improving like that, he was sure that no one would be able to beat her in a sword fight. Her attention fixed on our boy, she started blushing like a tomato and with a surprised gaze asked how Cyan could be giving compliments after what had just happened. Cyan put his hand under his chin, and his mind filled with curiosity. He began to observe her and it didn't take long for him to realize that she wasn't going to understand him. He assumed he wouldn't have to do much given the level she was at now. He turned around to Brian and asked him to train with her. Upon hearing this, Brian began pointing at himself with his finger and with a confused gaze asked if he wanted him to train with Leximus, to which Cyan nodded. He turned towards Leximus and with a serene expression decided to leave Brian with her for training. She picked up the sword again, stood up, and with an uncertain gaze accepted and decided to switch to a wooden sword. Cyan approached Brian and handed him the sword. Brian prepared to take the sword and his eyes filled with confusion, asking where he was going, to which our boy replied that he had an important matter to attend to. Cyan turned his back on them and began to walk away. Brian took the sword, started touching his head with his hand, and with a forced smile said that he was looking forward to their training. At first Leximus stood watching in silence, but then her eyes filled with excitement, and with a smile she said that she was excited. Upon seeing this, Brian couldn't help but panic, thinking that she was very terrifying. Cyan walked away from the academy's training field and began to wander around the area. He felt a familiar feeling. After walking for a while, he saw Lunev standing in front of him. He started observing her and couldn't help but wonder what she was doing at this hour. It was nighttime, and with a lost expression, she began silently observing something, immersed in her thoughts. She remained silently watching for several minutes. Cyan approached her, his eyes filled with curiosity. He wanted to know what she was doing. In front of them stood a building, the research laboratory of instructor Boris. Cyan went on alert, not knowing what she was doing here. He began to walk toward her, and with a curious gaze, asked if she intended to enter. Upon hearing his voice, she came out of her trance, and her attention fixed on him. With a calm expression, she asked how he knew this if all she had done was look at the place. Seeing this, Cyan's eyes filled with confusion. He couldn't believe that she really intended to enter. With a serene voice, she explained that she was curious. She began to remember Boris when he had bowed his head before them. Her mind was full of curiosity since she had never heard his name before, not even in the Garam Association. The only thing she knew was that he was an 8th Circle mage. It was strange that no one knew anything about him. The look on our boy's face filled with confusion and surprise, realizing that she was just getting herself into trouble. Lunev put a hand behind her back, started pointing at the building with her finger, and with an exciting smile asked if Cyan was going to help her. Our boy became confused, not knowing why he should help her. She started staring at him intently, and it didn't take long for her to realize that they already knew each other and she knew that he hated Boris. Cyan approached her, closed his eyes, and let out a sigh. Now both of them were going to get into trouble. Seeing this, Lunev couldn't help but smile. A few hours later, Boris left the laboratory, and without making any noise, Cyan and Lunev entered inside. He peeked his head around the corner, began observing the door, and no longer felt any presence. He put his hand in front of her and with a serious gaze decided to go first, asking her to stay behind him. Despite feeling somewhat unsure, she accepted without hesitation. Our boy brought his hand close to the doorknob and used the technique called basim, causing the lock to open. Several seconds later, the door opened. Inside, there was a pile of books on a table. Cyan and Lunev stood silently observing the place. In the room, there was also a bookshelf full of books. Upon seeing so many books, they thought Boris was a nerd who liked collecting books. While Cyan was looking for something suspicious in the room, Lunev approached one of the books and started reading it. Her eyes filled with surprise upon seeing that most of the books were about ancient magic. At that moment, our boy's expression changed. He began to feel a strange mana and couldn't help but go on alert. He started looking outside through the window. On the roof was Karam. He didn't know what she was doing there, to which she replied that she was just lying on the roof and asked him to continue doing what he was doing. Cyan's eyes filled with confusion as he did not know what she was doing on the roof. Lunev, who was investigating the books, revealed that she had found something. Upon hearing this, with an expression full of curiosity, our boy turned around and couldn't help but be somewhat surprised. She approached an altar where there was a book different from the rest. She placed her hand on top of the book and soon realized it was a very old book. This book had a gem in the middle. She took the book, and Cyan quickly realized that this was not just any ordinary book but Boris's armor called Herchkria. At the same time, Karam began to manifest herself. She appeared on top of the building's roof, crossed her arms, and couldn't help but think that this smell was disgusting no matter how many times she smelled it, asking someone to come out at once. Her eyes were full of rage. She clenched her teeth tightly and gave the order to Herchkria to come out. At that moment, feathers began to fall from the sky, and an angel with giant wings and white hair started descending from the sky. He began to smile since it had been a long time since the last time, asking how she had awakened after 3 centuries. Karam, who had her arms crossed, remained silently watching. Despite being full of fury, she began to show a forced smile, and replied that she was in a good mood but now he had just ruined it. Herchkria started observing her with a cheerful expression and couldn't help but smile upon seeing that her personality hadn't changed at all. He assumed that this was why she had chosen Cyan as the owner of all the people. Upon hearing this, Karam lost her composure, and with an angry gaze, prepared to attack, asking what he was insinuating. Herchkria descended onto the roof, asking Karam to calm down. He approached and with a smile mentioned that he was here to help her. Karam's mind filled with many questions, and with a confused expression, she asked what he wanted to talk about. Herchkria closed his eyes, began to show a smile, and raised a finger. Seeing this, Karam's eyes filled with rage, but even so, she started smiling, asking what the hell he was trying to do. At the same time, inside the laboratory, Lunev opened the book and with a curious expression began reading. She had never seen a magical text like this before. It was like a history book. Our boy began to gaze at the book in silence, not knowing what it was. The book was written in secret language and contained many symbols. She placed her hand on top of the page and realized that the texts were written as if they were a code. It would take her some time to decode it. With a lost look, she explained that this was the only thing she could recognize. She began to touch the drawing of a sun. This book was unfinished, and she didn't know what this meant. She put her hand under her chin and started observing the sun, thinking about the sun, dark clouds, and fog. Upon hearing this, our boy couldn't help but go on alert, his eyes filling with fear. Quickly, he closed the book with his hand, leaving her somewhat confused. With a serious gaze, he revealed that they had to destroy this book. Upon hearing this, her mind filled with many questions. With a confused expression, she asked for the reason. Cyan's eyes were full of seriousness. His attention was fixed on the book as he realized that it was what had caused the blood banquet as well as all the other catastrophes. At that moment, someone appeared and said they could not let that happen. Upon hearing this, Cyan's expression changed. He turned around and couldn't help but panic and clench his teeth tightly upon realizing it was Boris. He hadn't sensed his presence because he'd been distracted by this. The book began to emit a powerful golden light. Cyan and Lunev covered their eyes and moved away so as not to go blind. The book shot out and appeared in Boris's hand. He placed his hand on his chest, closed his eyes, and with a smile mentioned that he was thinking about whether he should go see Cyan or not. But it was a coincidence that now they had met here. For him, it was quite unpleasant that they were spying on him in this way. Upon hearing this, Cyan couldn't help but get angry, while on the other side, Lunev became confused since she didn't know what was happening. Boris's eyes began to shine. he started to extend his hand toward them and asked if she could leave the two of them alone. At that moment, Lunev's body was thrown backward until it hit and went out through the window. Cyan was in shock, and his eyes were full of surprise. Boris began pointing at our boy with his finger and with a smile mentioned that he had been a bit rough, but there was nothing to worry about since he had sent Lunev to her dorm. The window was now broken. Boris, who was standing at the door holding the book, decided to talk to our boy alone. An exciting smile appeared on his face. He was very interested in him, in the version he showed to the world and the version he kept hidden. Cyan went on alert, started staring at him intently, realizing that this was not good, even though he wanted to kill him. Herchkria was a problem. The book called Herchkria began to emit a powerful golden aura. Cyan was somewhat upset since this had happened while Karam was not there. At the same time, she was lying on the roof with her arms behind her head. With a furious expression, she asked what he was talking about. Herchkria, who had his eyes closed, began to smile and revealing a finger showed that the person whom her owner served was a person chosen by God, so Karam was on the losing side now. She ignored it, closed her eyes and asked why should a demonic sword like her side with Lumendal and betray her owner. With a serene smile, Herchkria replied that it was not necessary since there were many more ways. His body began to emit a powerful golden energy. His attention fixed on Karam, revealing that if she stole Cyan's body it would be difficult even for them to deal with her. Karam opened her eyes and her gaze filled with curiosity. With a smile she asked what they were planning to do. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.